Welcome, everyone. It's my honor and pleasure and privilege to be interviewing a close friend, colleague of many years, Ann Casement. We've traveled the world together in many different sorts of ways, and her love of exploration and travel seems to have come from her childhood. So I'm going to ask her to tell us a little bit about your background as a British Indian.
Yes, thank you. And very much British Indian. I like that. That's how I always introduce myself. Two things are there from the very first day I arrived in this world: India and Catholicism. Where do I start? What would you like me to say about India? Well, let me say one thing. I grew up in Bombay, which is, as you know, one of the great cities of India, still is. And also the Bollywood. So two of my friends in the day school, I did have a stint at boarding school up in the hills, were daughters of Bollywood producers, and all the producers actually were Muslims. All the money men, basically.
Yeah.
And of course, it's also the stock exchange in India is in Bombay. So it's kind of New York, Washington, Bombay, Delhi. And Bombay is much more fun. So I grew up there, but of course, for me, every day I saw on the streets poverty, disease, and death, because Indian funerals are very open. You know, you see the corpse, it's on a stretcher, it's covered with flowers, but the face is open. Mm-hmm. And I often would join the cortege, and I would talk to some of the people who were not, because I spoke quite fluent Hindi at that time. I would talk about the dead person. I would try and find out something about them. And that was very, very, it was part of daily life in Bombay.
So this connection to the dead reminds me of the Red Book and the reading that Sonu's helped us to understand Jung's interest in the unconscious as the realm of the dead. So you had your first introduction there on the streets of Bombay.
I had never made that connection. That's a very nice one. Thank you.
Yeah, and
may I say something else about you, Bombay? Because the first place he touched down in was Bombay, and my great uncle Willie ran Bombay Harbour, because the British, of course, at that time they ran India for the empire. Jung is then confronted with the reality of India, which is what I've just said. It hits you in all your senses, but there's a lot, that's very difficult for a Westerner coming there for the first time to be confronted by, on the streets, people who maimed, lepers. I have no horror of leprosy, because for me it was a daily thing. I used to go, I worked once every week, usually once a week, not always, with my great aunt, who is a rabid Catholic, in one of the slums in Bombay. And there were lepers living amongst and the poverty there is something else again. So every day of my life, I think, at least of my conscious life, thank God that I have enough to eat and enough, somewhere to sleep.
Indeed.
Because the people were sleeping on the pavements. So this was I'm talking about in the smart parts of the city.
Yes. So the elements of social justice and environmental justice become ingrained by these kinds of early experiences. And this meeting of East and West, it seems like that's also been another important axis in your life.
Oh, very much so. They're both in me very strongly. India's there all the time. I'm actually very Indian in many ways. I think a Westerner probably doesn't see that, but an Indian does. I immediately connect with any Indian that if I'm at a reception or and a couple of young friends of mine are coming over from Texas next week. One of them, his father's Indian, my kind of Indian. And so I'm looking forward to that with great pleasure. He's actually Anglo-Indian. I'm British Indian, which is a bit different.
Yes, well, and you know, the Jungian community in India is small but growing, and
It is, yes, indeed.
Yeah.
In Ahmedabad and in Bangalore.
Yes, Bangalore and Ahmedabad, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, from what brought you from India then back to Europe?
Well, I was there for Independence Day, and I was absolutely so excited. I can't tell you about Independence Day. And I was one of the girls chosen to dress in an Indian costume. I represented the Punjab. And we did an Indian dance, and we sang a little song in Hindi. And then we sang the Jana Gana, the great anthem. And so I was very excited, but I had no idea, of course, at that time, I was quite young still, that would mean I'd have to leave my motherland. Of course, that was a great wrench. But yes. I left because I was 13. I was very fortunate to stay that long. And Congress decided then that any members of the Raj who was still then been born in India would then become Indian citizens. And I was very happy to do that, but I'm afraid the parental authorities weren't. So I was taken out of India and brought to London to join my father, who was in London to be demobbed after the war. He had been an officer in the war.
During the Second World War, yes. And then you ended up at the Sorbonne for your undergraduate studies.
Yes. Yes, I was very fortunate to do that because it was partly a personal thing. I was very close to someone in Paris, and that's why I chose it, rather than going to Oxford to take classics, which is what my Latin teacher had hoped I was going to do. And I say, classics would have been wonderful, of course. But
that post-war period was very rich in Paris with all the philosophical foment there.
My goodness, I was having, I was at a dinner that Sartre gave at the Select, which is one of those great brasseries in Montparnasse, because I was well connected.
Sure.
And Levi-Strauss, who had an enormous impact on me. He was such a marvelous man and very austere persona, but a man of great warmth underneath that.
So you had a wonderful, it's one of those moments in time where these things all come together, and the good fortune of having to, the opportunity to be able to meet these personalities and have them influence some of your thinking. And you went on then to the London, School of Economics, where you got a degree in anthropology, physical and social, if I recall.
Well, yes. What I thought anthropology was going to be James Fraser and the Golden Bough. And of course, I hardly need to tell you it wasn't. But the reason I took anthropology was because meeting Levi-Strauss, I was so impressed by him. He was quite interested in me because he admired what the British had done in India. They had anthropologists working amongst the indigenous in India for 100 years before they had left. And so compared to what the French did with their colonies, Algeria, Vietnam, hardly say more about that. He felt the British had done a really good job there.
And so this cross-cultural experience that you had is now being deepened and enriched through these contacts. And then as an anthropologist, you're now formally trained that way. And what a rich background to bring to the whole field of analysis, depth psychology, Jungian analysis. to have that larger picture of humankind that transcends some of the individual psyche components that we think of more generally in a dyadic clinical situation.
Well, actually, yes, I couldn't agree with you more, but the first year that I was doing anthropology at the LSE, which is a great place to be, by the way,
Yes.
was, for me, the real eye-opener was physical anthropology. So we were studying a lot of, we weren't studying fossils, that was at UCL much more, but we were looking at back at 4 million years ago. We were looking at Lucy with
yes.
Okay, you know everything, Joe. I've always
Oh no,
I
I'm
don't have
just
to explain anything to this or so on.
well, I'm excited by this material.
But it's a Danish name, isn't it? The paleontologist who wrote that wonderful book on Lucy. I'm not sure that Leakey agreed with him, as you know, as the great Leakey. I knew Richard Leakey quite well, and he, in fact, asked me at one point later on if I would like to go to a site he was excavating at Lake Turkana in northern, what's now called Kenya. And I was interested because I could have written something for The Economist about it, but also because of my anthropological background, he thought I would find it very fascinating. And then I actually sat down and thought about it seriously. And I thought, my goodness, that's going to be a very tough consignment, assignment, because it would be cut off from everyone and everything. A helicopter would come in occasionally with supplies. You're up in the north of Kenya, fascinating.
But when we think of like Freud and Jung's archaeology of the mind and the kind of layering of the unconscious, I mean, this is a kind of living physical experience of it.
Well, absolutely. So I became terribly interested, in Paleolithic man and Neolithic, which is much closer to us, and what was happening millions of years ago. And then we also, what we were looking at were blood groups. We were studying blood groups, not races. We didn't talk in terms of race or ethnic groups. We talked about blood groups. And so I learned enormous amounts. We went in completely unprepared to have this incredible thing being brought to me, this knowledge, which I actually love that better than the social anthropology part of it, which of course, with my background, it was very interesting.
Sure. Well, how did you make the transition then from that world to the world of analysis?
From millions of years ago?
Yes, we're in the world of physical anthropology and the looking at and
well,
now
it was
to the
more
mind.
what they made of me. It was very funny because I was already getting in. I started my first Jungian analysis very young. I was already, I was being seen as a budding psychoanalyst, and this was very strange to those anthropologists. They had no time for psychoanalysis.
Yeah, that's a link that unfortunately has been largely lost. I wondered if you'd say a little bit about, I just think back in the history of people like W.H.D. Rivers and so forth.
I'm so glad you mentioned him. Yes, I absolutely. He's. Oh goodness, yes. Words fail me for once. But yeah, there was an incredible centenary in 1998 that I went to at St. John's, Cambridge, a college I'm very fond of, to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Torres Straits expedition, where anthropologists and psychologists joined together and went on this marvelous expedition, led, of course, by Rivers himself. Seligman, also from LSE. The reason I chose LSE, of course, was because Malinowski worked there. And so I used to sit in the library and then I think, oh my God, Malinowski was giving his lectures, was giving his seminars surrounded by adoring students. oh, you know, it's
Golden
breathtaking.
age, yes, that golden
Yes,
age.
yes. I'm very keen on Malinowski. Um, and yes, I'm sorry, I lost my thread, but yeah, that's so they looked down, I have to say, on psychoanalysis because they thought it was totally unscientific, whereas they claimed that they were scientists. Um, that's their claim. I'm not saying that I necessarily 100% go along with it, but and so I had to. I could make links in my own mind, but when it came to my thesis, though, I did actually make links between Levi-Strauss's thinking and Jung's, and I need hardly say more. They're huge. I mean, he just borrowed
Yes,
there from Jung without
yes.
acknowledging it.
And without acknowledging, unfortunately.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
He was a trickster in that way.
Yeah, it feels like it's been to the detriment of both fields not to stay in some kind of dialogue. And maybe
Well,
that's part of our future.
yeah, but you know, for Levi-Strauss, he claimed his great influences were Marxism, um,
Mhm.
and what were the other things? Oh gosh, what's my memory goes every now and then. These three mistresses, as he called them, geology, of course,
Mhm.
because he was also very interested in, you know, Paleolithic and
Yeah.
so on, but geology rather than paleontology. And there was, what was the other one? And psychoanalysis, but he meant Freudian psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
But actually, there's so much Jung in his work, and so that was what I wrote about. And I had the wonderful Ernest Gellner, who was, you know, who interviewed me for my thesis. He was very dubious about psychoanalysis himself. But he thought I made a reasonable case for making the links between Jung and Levi-Strauss. And then Gellner wanted me to do, that was my first offer of doing a doctoral dissertation on an anthropological survey of psychoanalysis and working with him at King's Cambridge. And I thought, wow,
Yeah.
sort of like, who, me? But I couldn't do it because it would have meant traveling a great deal, you know, to the United States, to Europe, as we can now call it. And I had commitments that I wouldn't allow me to do that.
You've had to make a lot of hard choices. You know?
The worst one was having to leave psychiatry.
Yeah.
Yes, and I had to choose there, and that was that was the worst one of all, I think. I didn't choose to leave India; that was imposed on me.
Imposed on you, yeah.
That's one thing I think I've never got over. One doesn't, you just
deep roots there.
You just don't get over losing your motherland.
Yeah.
I feel at some level that I've lived in exile since I was 13.
Oh, yes, the homecoming feeling is so crucial.
Mm.
Well, what about your home at the JAP?
Oh gosh, we could talk the rest of the interview, and I'd be happy to do that about my what I'm so grateful to JAP because it's given me a great deal, and I hope I've done my bit there. The reason I came to it was because I was a very, very close friend of the wonderful Rosemary Gordon.
Yes.
And very close, as close as I am to you. And Rosemary and I just adored each other. And she was such a brilliant analyst. Yeah. She started off being a Kleinian. And she shared an apartment with Pearl King, who was the archivist of the British Society and also on secretary of the IPA. And then Rosemary started discovering Jung and realized that this was really where she belonged. And so she changed. But she always carried that mainstream psychoanalytic part of herself too. And we used to meet regularly. We used to socialize a lot with our partners, as they're called nowadays. And her husband actually was a very distinguished BBC documentary maker. Yes. Peter Montagnon. And so at one point, then Rosemary said to me, she used to talk to me quite a bit about the journal and even about the SAP, and I'd have to keep reminding her that she wasn't on either. But we were close enough friends, so she felt she could talk about things that concerned her. And eventually she asked me if I would write reports on papers that were sent in to be published. And I said, yes, I'd like that. That's how I started.
Yes, I know that's your first paper in the JAP, as I recall.
I mentioned that. She was asking me to report on papers that were submitted by other authors for publication.
Well, in 1995, you wrote a paper on the history of the splits in the UK.
Oh, yes, I did. Yes.
And yeah. I know that because that was, I'm interested in the history of the journal from my own days there, and it was really interesting to see how you were very mindful and thoughtful of the complexities that were going on, and how you presented that history, and that led. Your involvement with the journal there led to our meeting and the development of our friendship at the first of the conferences in Maine at Sabasco Lodge in, I believe it was 1998.
Well, a long time ago, yes, indeed. Yes. We hit it off straight away, but we're both talkers, aren't we, and thinkers. Yes, indeed. It was actually Colleen and Barbara who invited me onto the executive committee, and Giles Clark and I were the first non-SAP members of the JAP's executive committee, which was and Giles was also very mainstream, although he belonged to one of the classical union organizations. So Colleen and Barbara then asked me if I'd write this paper for the 40th anniversary of the journal issue. And so I went around interviewing all the people that were involved in the various splits that occurred. There's really a lot of trouble in the 70s.
Yes.
And one of them being, of course, Michael Fordham.
Yes, of course.
Michael, who was a rather chilly personality. But I spent a whole day with Michael at his home, Severals in Berkshire. And my admiration for Michael is enormous. I think that the Jungian world owes more to him than anyone apart from Jung himself.
He was quite remarkable. I know when I spoke at the 50th anniversary of the journal, I went back as a part of that and read the early history of the journal. It came about just the same time as the IAP. And I was really impressed by Michael Fordham's papers in those early years. They seamlessly integrated the archetypal with the developmental, and with a kind of clinical brilliance. It was really, it was breathtaking to see that. And I thought, oh, what a shame that we've lost this way of being able to work in a kind of multidimensional fashion.
Well, I wrote a chapter on the founding of the journal in Puan's Jung, and many people, including Ulrich Kearney, contributed knowledge on that to me, which Ulrich's always been very generous whenever I've approached him. And so that I got so much from writing that, because I found out, what Michael actually had to go through to found the journal in the first place. Mario Jacobi, if you remember him, lovely man, was very much Zurich, but also very open to the developmental, and he had great admiration for Michael. So I interviewed Mario. I was very fond of Mario Jacobi. I think we all were.
Yes, indeed.
And he gave me a lot of information which I put in. So that's how I learned about that history of the founding of the journal.
Yes, and Jung himself contributed to the some of the early, and I was really struck when I read his Jung's contributions, because he'd picked up cybernetics and he was already talking about the psyche as a self-regulating system. This is back in the mid-50s. I mean, the synthetic quality of his mind, you know, I can see how he and Michael Fordham must have made an interesting set of dialogue partners.
Well, two things I want to say about that. One is in a chapter I did for Murray's book, you know, the Red Book. I ended up saying it seemed to me the Red Book was the best possible text for exploring the existence of God in cyberspace. And I wasn't kidding.
Yeah.
The other was what you just said about Michael, and I've lost my thread there a bit.
As a dialogue partner with Jung. I mean, I've read some of the correspondence
very
between
much
them.
So. I didn't get to know Michael as well as I knew Gerhard Adler, and I think James Astor's.
James Astor, yes.
And somebody else that I have tremendous admiration and respect for. Has written an excellent book on Michael, as you know.
Yes.
But my sense of him, of Michael, is that he never did analyze with Jung, as you know.
Yes, I know.
He was always slightly guarded. He was, you know, he never claimed to not be a Jungian. He always said he was a Jungian psychoanalyst. But the person he really loved was Emma Jung.
Isn't that interesting?
He wrote so warmly about her.
Oh.
And I've come to love her from, you know, doing research on her. She's an admirable woman. She really was.
Yes, I think there's much more to be written about her and her contributions.
I think she's marvelous.
You can feel that her holding in containment around the whole Red Book period. That she's a presence in the background there that really allows that. Yeah. I mean, I know he had other engagements with other people, but that ability to enter into that space at home on a kind of nightly basis seems to me to have been.
You do have a very diplomatic way of putting things, which I admire. I did ask Sonu once, because I've interviewed Sonu. I've done quite a lot of interviewing myself, so I know what an onerous task it is, but I've interviewed Sonu a couple of times, I think for the journal, actually.
Yes.
And I said, who was the most important woman in Jung's life? And he said, without hesitation, Emma.
Yeah.
And when you learn more about Emma, you can see exactly why.
Yes, indeed. I mean, she really was a powerful container. I mean, and in the sense, not just a passive container. I mean, one that could actively metabolize.
Absolutely nothing passive about that.
Yeah.
And Gerhard had analysis with Jung himself and with Tony Wolff. But it was Helen Alfred who had analysis with Emma. And she was my training analyst at Hella. And she said, you know, her analysis with Emma was the making of her.
No, I'm not surprised. The more I've looked at some of the historical material, the more I can feel her powerful but gentle touch that's in the background.
And an intellect in her own right.
Yes.
I mean, she studied mathematics. She learned fluent French in order to write, you know, the book she was writing on the Grail.
Yes, I know. I was very impressed also in Copenhagen at the IAP Congress when Axel Honning's paper talked about you know, the finding of the Aurora Consurgens, and it was really Emma's research in Paris that located the incipit and you know, sort of found the way into that material, to that alchemical material. Absolutely. I was really surprised.
That's what I'm getting at. I mean, the more one studies her, the more one realizes just what a creative, splendid, intellectual woman she was.
Yeah. Well, psychoanalysis was a place where some of the kind of older patriarchal structures were gradually breaking down, and I think it was a place where women began to really find a voice, thankfully.
Yolanda Jacobi is another one I have tremendous admiration for.
Yes.
tremendous.
real intellect. Yeah, she really
Oh
could
gosh,
synthesize. Yeah,
yes, yes, and courage, because she went back to finish her degree at Vienna
yeah.
University after the Anschluss. Can you believe it? And she's Jewish.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's
I mean, God, I mean,
she's a courageous woman. Yes.
that is just, that's courage beyond the call of duty.
Now, maybe there's another book looming here. I can feel it. We talk. There's a
You
lot of
write
energy.
it. I'm all booked out. I don't want to do another one.
Well, you've got a great series behind you at this point. And let's make sure we get into a couple of other areas of your
Yes, of
interest.
course.
One is, and I think it's of interest to the journal readers, would be neuropsychoanalysis. You
Oh
were one of the
gosh.
founding members
Oh
of
gosh, yes. Oh
the
heavens, that's it.
societies.
Oh heavens, oh heavens. It just gets more and more and more important for me. I have a very close collegial relationship with Mark Soms, who is the
Yes.
president, and one of the two people who actually started the. We've gone through so many name changes, I can never keep up with it, but it started off being the International Psychoanalytic Association, something like that.
Yeah.
Now I think it's the International Neuropsychoanalysis, one word, society. But Mark, he's so generous. He did a wonderful blurb for the back of my Jung introduction book. Really wonderful. I was overwhelmed.
Yes.
By what he said there, that I email him from time to time, and I emailed him recently because I was a case I was supervising on somnambulism, and his response was absolutely wonderful. I mean, you can ask him anything. He reminds me of you in that way. I know I used to email you and say, Joe, what about? And I knew you'd always come up with the goods. And Mark is the same.
Yes, I've always been very impressed with his writing and his thinking. I mean, just feels it's on the cutting edge of so many things. And one of the things, and I was thinking about our having this conversation, was the some of the neuroscientific work that's coming out about the sublime. It's in its early days, but I've seen some papers now, sort of differentiating beauty and the sublime through, fMRI studies and so forth. Yeah.
Absolutely. This is where one can correctly use the term awesome.
Yes, yes, that's where it belongs. Yes,
I like the colloquialism too, but
yeah.
it's absolutely, and as you know, the Lacanians and another Jungian and myself put together a conference and also a book on the sublime, which was a very interesting thing to do. I've always been interested in Lacan because of my time in Paris, of course.
Yes. Yes. Well, you've put together two books, and the one, of course, with David Tacey on the idea of the numinous, and this book on the sublime, the blazing sublime. And I wonder, you've pointed out in some of your writing there that Jung always formally in his writing went to the numinous, to Otto and that line.
Otto is doing both, yeah.
But how important the sublime may have been, and why he didn't claim it overtly. It's clearly in his work.
Yeah, I wrote a chapter on that. I gave a brief paper at we had a conference again, St. John's, Cambridge, and then out of that came a book eventually. And this is where I read everything critically. I have a critical mind. I hope not destructive, because why would I want to destroy something I spent most of my life dedicated to? But being critical of Jung's lack of use, and also the way it seemed to me that he went, yes, Kant is a great influence on him, but he went to the wrong Kant there. If he'd gone to the, what's it called, the
Critique of judgment.
Critique, yes, that was the third one. You know, the critique of judgment.
Yes, I think that's the third one. Yeah.
There he would have found, you know, what he's looking for so much more, I think, than the critique of pure reason, which is wonderful as far as I can understand it. Kant is not the greatest writer in the world, let's face it.
Yeah, you know, it makes me wonder, especially when I think about, you know, that anxiety he had when Maria Moltzer showed up or sent him that letter about what you're doing is art.
Yes,
and he had a moment of
and when Ricklin, you know, got as he thought, seduced into being an artist rather than a psychoanalyst. Yeah, he was afraid of that. And I've seen some of his paintings. Apart from the Red Book, I went to the exhibits, I think, in Zurich, and he was terribly good.
Yes, I mean, he really had enormous talent, but there was that fear. It always, and I don't know whether this is accurate, but I've wondered whether he has this sense of aesthetics being secondary to truth, rather, you know, and that somehow he would lose something fundamental or essential there, which is, I think, a misreading.
Gosh, you're raising something really interesting there, because, as you know, he's very close to Nietzsche. And for Nietzsche, the only truth existed in the arts. He totally despised so-called scientific truth.
Right.
But, you know, it's interesting that he ignores that part of Nietzsche.
You know, he you know, in the typology book, he has a lot of references to this, but he doesn't develop this. And his whole notion of individuation, it's always struck me as a little curious that it doesn't have the aesthetic dimension as a part of the individuation of the person.
And the arts are fundamental in my life. You know, I'm still, oh my goodness, music and paintings, literature. I grew up with that. I was very fortunate to discover opera when I was 11. And as you perhaps know, I was on the council of the Met in New York for some years, which was a great experience, but that's something else again. Nothing so much to do with psychoanalysis.
Well, yeah, that's one of the questions is how do we see the experience of aesthetics in the dreams of patients, in the transformations that they undergo throughout clinical work. It does seem to me that that may not be an overt focus of the work, but it is part of what emerges over time in the process of analysis.
Well, I often hear analysts saying, you know, if I encourage my patients to draw something, I'm telling them to beware of, you know, getting seduced by the art and trying to produce a work of art, and I kind of frown because, again, you know, it seems to me that's denigrating how important art is for our psyche.
Yes, indeed. And, you know, so many people, when they look at the Red Book, it's the art that activates something at a very deep level for them.
My editor, the book's editor, as it was then called, at The Economist, when I reviewed the Red Book, actually the week it came out that it was published in New York, when we were there for the, you know, for the launch in New York. And so I had Sonu right there, and I could show him my review before I you know, shot it back to The Economist in London. And Fiametta, who was then the book's editor, knows she's the culture super editor now of The Econ, and knows a lot about art. She asked me, she said she was lost in admiration when she saw Jung's art, and she asked me if Jung had actually done it himself. She said, "This is great art." Well, I'm not sure about great art, but, you know, it's very good indeed.
Yes, and it's certainly visionary art. I mean, that's part of it.
She was really, really astonished. She was more interested in the art than she was in the text. I don't think she understood this. I don't think she tried to read the text, but But it was wonderful doing that review that very week that it was launched in New York and having Sonu there, so I could run the review past him. I don't think he changed anything in it, but it was good to have his.
It's always good to have that kind of dialogue with somebody with that kind of immense historical understanding of these things. And what a gift it's been for all of us.
Are we winding down?
No, there are a couple of other things.
Oh.
I'm hoping we have time for a couple of more.
Yes, no, I'm happy. I'm at your disposal as long as you want.
Okay. Well, there are a couple of things that we haven't touched on. There is one more in neuropsychoanalysis.
Yes.
If I understand the new directions that group is taking, there's a link between the collective unconscious and the basal ganglia.
And I wondered, what I'm writing right now.
and
that thing we're doing at Pacifica.
Yes, and could you say something about maybe how this is an advance over previous attempts? Throughout the last 50 years, there have been many attempts to try to locate the Jungian version of the unconscious somewhere within the kind of brain soma of the person, and they've always fell a bit short. And I'm wondering how this new approach is more integrative.
Well, the key word here is affect.
Yeah.
Because the focus of neuropsychoanalysis is on affect, not cognition.
Yeah.
And the focus for Jung is on affect, right, not cognition.
Right. And
this is what I'm expounding in my presentation. I'm going to be giving at Pacifica, that the two of us are part of that gang that Stefano has brought together.
Yes.
He's kind of founding a little club of us. He keeps asking us to write books for him and do lectures at the university.
Must admit, it felt a little strange to be listed as an ancestor.
I know what you mean. But in my case, it's absolutely the right word. In your case,
well, I think any of us that are still trying to formulate our thought. How does that leave us?
At first I said, I don't want to do it. Because I just finished writing the Jung introduction book, and I was putting together a book from the Fay lectures, and I just felt,
I wondered.
Much, you know how it is. So, at the moment I'm struggling to keep up with my writing because there's just always so much to do, isn't there?
Yes, indeed. But you are going to try to bring out the book on the shadow, your Fay lecture material?
Yes, Texas A&M. Well, they did.
Good.
I think your book was published by
yes.
Texas, and Sean Fitzpatrick, who now runs the Jung Center in Houston, is excellent. He was the copy editor. At the moment, it's with the editor of the whole series at Texas A&M itself. And he's just finishing doing Hae-Young Shen, or Shen Hae-Young's book, because Shen Hae-Young was the one before me at Houston. And so once he's finished Hae-Young, he will, and of course, China is another thing perhaps you want to touch on, because you and I have a lot in common over that wonderful place.
Yeah, that would be one of the last topics. Before we leave that, before we get there, I wanted to go.
Sorry, forgive me. I'm always, jumping up.
Well, you've got such a rich background in so many places, and it's hard to hop over some of the things and not give them an opportunity. Can I say
something about that? Sure. When I trained to be of course, a therapist first, and then she went on to train to be a psychoanalyst. I had no idea that I was taking on several careers and doing that. And I've become administrator, events organizer, treasurer, head of organizations, chair of ethics, which you, thank you very much, when you were president of the IAAP, you appointed me chair of the ethics committee of the IAAP. So kind of part lawyer, which is, my father always wanted me to be trained as a barrister. But the law, which I think I would have found very interesting, never really grabbed me like psychoanalysis
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
my calling, as Jane, that wonderful Jane Solomon used to put it.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yeah. The vocation. Yeah, I must admit, that's the same for me. I mean, I have a background in
Oh, you
sciences,
could be
and
anything, Joe.
well, but this is really the place
Well,
that's home.
exactly.
Yeah, I feel like we share that, and
Exactly.
um, I know you've done a lot of statutory work in the UK as well.
Oh,
I
that
mean,
was a hugely important thing that I worked on. Briefly, it came about because while I was chair, as we call it in England,
yeah,
in the UK, rather than president, I turned down.
yes,
I didn't want to be called president. I'm not a presidential person. I was chair of an outfit called the UKCP, United
yes,
Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy. It's one of the it's the biggest, I think, numerically, umbrella organization for psychoanalysts, psychotherapists of every modality. We had 8 modalities at that time. It may be bigger now. I'm talking about some years ago. So I went around because I've, never been backward and coming forward, so to speak. I went around interviewing peers in the House of Lords and MPs in the House of Commons to talk about the work of UKCP.
yes,
Because we'd always been interested in being statutorily regulated,
regular.
licensed, as you call it. I am
Yes,
licensed in New York State, so I'm
yes, you do.
very
Yes,
fortunate to have that. And I met with a peer called John Alderdice in the Lords, one of the many Lords I met with. And out of the blue, he said to me, would you be interested if I brought a private member's bill to regulate psychotherapists? The title was very important because everyone can claim they're doing psychotherapy.
okay,
Others can say, I'm doing psychotherapy with my child. Teachers, nurses, doctors, medics.
yeah,
So I fell off my chair, but when I recovered, I said, yes. So we very quickly then moved from that initial meeting. John moves fast. He was very much part of the Northern Ireland peace agreement. He did
ah,
a lot to
okay,
broker meetings between the Protestants and the Catholics,
Catholics. Yeah.
bringing Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness together.
Yes. Yeah. Wow. Wow. Yes.
I know, I know. I know. He said, if I can do that, I can do anything. He was a psychiatrist himself
Oh, oh,
in a former life, and so we got
that's
on
outstanding.
extremely well. He's a very virile, attractive man, and I'm terribly drawn to virile, attractive men. So we got all the so what John calls stakeholders together. I let him advise me as to who he included in that. Royal College Psychiatrists, British Psychological Society, the BCP, as it was then called, which was and which I'm now, of course, a member of, which was just for psychoanalysis, regulatory, voluntary regulatory body, and various others. And we met regularly in the House of Lords for about 2 years, working on this bill. We worked very amicably. There'd been a split inevitably between the UKCP and the BCP. And so I invited the chair of the BCP to the office at UKCP, and we got on famously because we were both shrinks, psychoanalysts.
Yeah, sure.
And so that was fine. And I'm glad to say the legacy of that is that now what's called BPC and UKCP do work quite amicably together. So that's one thing that
Awesome.
came from that. And we got 2
Really
years later, it had gone through first reading at the Lords. Then it came to the debate on the floor of the House of Lords. And this man called Stanley Clinton Davis, who was not the Undersecretary of State for Health in the Lords, but a spokesperson for the health in the House of Lords for the Labour Party, he just killed it. He said he wanted a more inclusive bill. Well, it's never materialized. He had a vague notion of what is more inclusive than the people we brought together. Admittedly, the councillors weren't included, but you can't have. John was very strict on that. He said no. We keep this to psychotherapists and their counsellors. right? So he killed it. And since then, the complaint system for psychotherapists and psychoanalysts in the UK is just appalling. And I did an endorsement of a book which has just come out on what a mess the complaint system is here. I'm not blaming anyone. All these umbrella organizations do the best they can.
Right.
But unless you have a regulation, statutory regulation, it's not there by law. So the way things stand at the moment, you're deemed guilty unless proved innocent, which is the complete opposite of what the law is here.
Yeah, sure.
So that is one thing that I still feel angry about, because that was a really destructive, I call it a piece of vandalism, actually.
Yeah.
And it's had long-reaching effects on the whole profession.
Yes, and these issues, as you know better than myself, the ethics issues that arise that need to be adjudicated are really enormously complex and individual, and require a real careful handling, or many people just end up injured. It is not it's not something simple or just a guidebook that can get you through all these kinds of things. It really requires a lot of thought and training.
Absolutely. It's just, I mean, these voluntary regulating bodies are doing their best. They really are. I've done work at the BPC. I've actually been on their ethics committee, the one that puts together the chairs that hear the complaints, which is a very tough job, as you know.
Yes.
And they do their best within the limits of not being regulated by law.
Yes. Well, I think one of our areas of weakness has been this lack of regulation and it's really skillful administration. That's been in the shadow of our community for a long time, and it's really, I think
I've got it in my genes, because I'm always, people look at me and then they see chair. Before I know it, I'm chairing.
They see confidence. Yeah, they see confidence.
Like you. And of course, I come from a long line of administrators.
Yes, and well, it's like you said, it's in the genes. So let's before we wind up, let's do one more just quick discussion about the future trends for the field. The survival of depth psychology, of Jungian analysis. What is the 21st century holding for us from your perspective? How do you see?
Oh heavens! It's a golden future. It's a golden present and future. People are coming back now to psychoanalysis. They've tried all these short-term things. They found out that yes, fine, it works for a while, but psychoanalysis has long-term beneficial effects. The evidence is piling up, not least by the work that Mark Thomas is doing. He gave a talk to us at the Royal Society of Medicine recently. It was all statistics on the long-term beneficial effects of psychoanalysis. And psychotherapy compared to psychoanalytic psychotherapy. Mark, of course, is a contemporary Freudian, so I think initially he's very dedicated to Freud. Initially, I think his idea was to do the work that Freud started doing in, I think it was 1898, when he published the scientific project.
The scientific
and actually that's such a fascinating thing to read, because he gets everything apart from synapses, which of course didn't exist then. This is 1895, and I think synapses are discovered in 1898, something like that.
This is Ramon
but he's got
Santiago
everything, neurons, he's got the whole work. Freud's a genius.
Yes, indeed.
So he abandons it eventually, because he doesn't have what we have, the scan and the technology. And so Mark was, I think, really initially he was continuing Freud's work because he's a dedicated Freudian, contemporary Freudian.
Yes.
And from there it got broadened out, and Jaak Panksepp was the other main person involved, a neurologist, but focusing on affective neuroscientists.
Science. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yeah, and Damasio and his work on the
Damasio was at that
genes.
first conference we had in 2000 at the Royal College of Surgeons. First time I heard Damasio. What a knockout that conference was. I thought, now this is changing my thinking completely.
Yeah.
Absolutely changed my thinking completely.
Yeah, and as you were pointing out earlier, Jung's valuing of affect and the imagination for organizing consciousness and thought seems to be
absolutely. It links to the material, the brainstem. This is in a nutshell what Mark's getting at. And that whole very controversial term consciousness that we bandy about. Yeah. David Chalmers made us.
I was just thinking of that.
I think he contributed a lot to make us aware of it being the hard problem, as he calls it. The trouble with Chalmers is that his focus is on cognitive neuroscience. As you know. I heard him recently, he was talking at an outfit I go to quite often called Intelligence Squared. I'm glad he's cleaned himself up, but he used to look like a tramp a lot of the time. But he, again, very interesting to listen to, but the whole emphasis is on cognition.
Cognition, yeah.
And looking for it in, the cerebral cortex.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Which is
as Freud was. Freud thought consciousness was located in the cerebral cortex.
Yes, well, maybe again, some of your Indian background comes in here with the Vedas and the vision of consciousness pervading it, that it's a primal aspect of the universe.
Oh, indeed.
And how do we?
That's very Hindu. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Well, as you know, Freud is very influenced through Schopenhauer by the Vedas.
Yeah,
the Nirvana principle, that's comes straight out of the Vedas. He's taking a lot from Hinduism and Buddhism through Schopenhauer, really.
Through Schopenhauer, yeah.
I adore Schopenhauer. I could talk for hours about him, but I won't. Can I, if we're winding down, just one thing.
Please, I was going to ask.
I believe would be of interest to our readers, and I'm very aware that we're doing this for the journal, which has been such a big part of your life and mine, and I'm so happy to see Arthur and Anne now as the co-editors in chief. I like them both enormously. Yeah. I know Arthur much better, but I also like Anne very much. But many years ago, Andrew, and there's only one Andrew in our world, isn't there, approached me and asked me if I knew of a file on Jung that had been sent to Nuremberg. There were trials in 1946 after the war, Second World War. And he'd been contacted by Richard Knoll. I think you know exactly what I mean by Richard Knoll, and asking about this. And Andrew knew that I knew some people in government, and so I immediately got on to a great friend of mine in the Cabinet Office, which the Cabinet Office is incredible. It's 20 members, all appointed by the Prime Minister himself. And they're there to support the Prime Minister, they're there to support government. So Gordon says, oh, sure. He rings up the FO, says, send down Casement file on Carl Gustav Jung that's going to go to Nuremberg. And sure enough, a couple of days later, it arrived. And that it's a piece of junk, actually. It was brought by, you probably, I've written about it, I know, in the past, but also I gave a copy to Mari and I gave a copy to Sonu because they were both so interested. And one or two other people, and I've run out of doing that because it's very bulky. It's full of absolute rubbish, but it's bulky.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you know what it's about, but it was this New Yorker who wanted to have Jung brought to trial at Nuremberg as a Nazi collaborator and an anti-Semite.
You're right.
And Noel was the kind of Jeff Mason of the Jungian world, roughly the same time that Jeff Mason was around doing the same thing. And I actually met Jeff Mason at one point, and I won't say any more about that. But so that's why Andrew had contacted me. And so I was very fascinated to read it. But when it arrived on the desk of the person at the FO who was being the representative to Nuremberg, he took one look at it and said, the best place for this is in the rubbish bin.
That's
just
right.
chucked it away. Now, that was the Morris Leon in New York was actually being goaded on by a man called Lord Vansittart in UK, who is an absolutely fanatic anti-German.
Yeah.
And so he saw Jung as a German. That's all he could see. And any German that he could bring down, he would do it, bend over backwards. So that was very interesting. And I popped a little bit about that into the Carl Gustav Jung book that I did for Windy Dryden 20 whatever years ago.
Yes, and very important to address those things in an open way. It seems to me that, you know, there's a number of stories that are still yet to be fully unpacked. I mean, we know Jung was involved in the OSS in the US when they first started.
Yes, yes, he was.
And was giving profiles on the Nazi generals to Eisenhower.
I've written about that too. I'm sure you have as well.
Yeah,
but I just thought that it would be of interest to read this in journal, because that's still about. I think the Jungians will always live under that shadow of being, the Nazi anti-Semite shadow.
Yeah. You know, one of the consequences of that I did want to ask you about, not that you've raised it, was Jung's. This was one of the things where I thought Jung's timing was terrible, where he starts to talk about cultural psychology in the late 20s and early 30s, just as the rise of fascism and Nazism are occurring on the world stage. And the timing of that quashed that whole reflection that he was starting, that I think, you know, Andrew did write about this in The Political Psyche, that I think there's the anthropological look at the way we could think about an unconscious that is more distributed within cultures, that we've lost the ability to think through that carefully. And I'd like to see a revival of that, quite honestly. Not of Jung's mistakes.
I'm getting very interested in Eric Goodwin's work on the journal. And we've had some emailing, and we keep trying to have a Skype discussion, but our workload just never permits it. But one day we will get to talk to each other. Yes, I mean, I'm an archetypal Jungian because I've always been an innatist, because I'm devoted to Plato, for one thing, absolutely devoted to Plato. And so what Goodwin's writing about, I think, is marvelous, because he's giving us the scientific evidence for that now. But the impact of culture, of course, on what's innate in us is enormous.
That's right.
So I quite understood, you and I understand what Jung was getting at. He's very interested in anthropology. He's very interested in cultural differences.
Yes.
And the impact of that on psyche. But because of his association with the Goering Institute in Berlin.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
I'm afraid some of the things that he said were perhaps on what we call unfortunate. Jeffrey Cox has done very good work on that.
Yes, he has. Yeah.
Anyone who's interested in the JAP would be well advised to look at his work.
Yes,
Jung,
I agree.
The Goering Institute, of course. Psychotherapy in the Third Reich.
Psychotherapy in the Third Reich is the one, the main book that
he's done 2 volumes of that.
Yeah, that's right.
Very interesting and balanced, really balanced.
Yes, really balanced view of Jung. Yeah. Okay, well, we've covered a range of things. Is there anything else that before we wrap up, that you'd like to?
Notes for myself, but I think By the way, just to stay on that topic, I did close to someone called Dan Burston, I'm sure you know, academic at the university in Pittsburgh, city I'm very fond of. And Dan asked me if I would, as he put it, shadow a book he was writing on anti-Semitism in the Jungian world.
Right.
In case, he wanted me to read everything he wrote about Jung and the Jungian world to check for errors and so on.
Yes.
And I must say, what he said there is pretty damning, actually.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know that work of his, but it came out a couple of years ago, I think.
I have some familiarity with it. I haven't studied it in depth, but I've been watching his conversations, and yes, I think we have to face the shadow pieces that are there,
I think we have to indeed,
and really make sure that we're not embedding them into our theory as we go forward. That we have a way of thinking through the consequences of these. And Jung's racism is another area that I think is
indeed, well, very linked to that. Yes. Well, racism, I'm not an ism person at all. I'm very much with Jung on that, and I critique that in various places. I think it's very easy to bandy around words like racism and sexism, and I really can't bear it because it's lacking in in-depth thinking.
Sure.
But according to today's way of looking at, the spirit of the times now.
Well, stereotyping groups of people.
I suppose one could say that there were, and I particularly critique Jung for this, what is it he calls it, that he gets from Levi-Bruhl, that ghastly phrase that Jungians to bandy about. You know the one I mean.
Yes, abaissement de niveau mental.
No, that's fine. That's the
Participation mystique.
A participation mystique. Oh, every time I hear that, I cringe. That is ghastly. And Jung, I'm afraid he turned to some unfortunate sources, because Levi-Bruhl was not actually an anthropologist, he was a philosopher.
Yes.
And all the practicing anthropologists of that time critique participation mystique and the way he talked about the primitive mentality.
Yes.
All of them, Americans, Europeans, British.
That's right.
And he eventually retracted, but Jung didn't. And he went on using that terrible phrase.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
And so you can imagine the reception I got when I, checked in the anthropological department at LSE, because they're saying to me, what about this? You're going to become a Jungian psychoanalyst, and can you stomach this kind of thing? So I said, no, I can't, and I shall be critiquing it, which I've subsequently done, of course, quite a bit. And in the latest shadow book, which will come out one day, sometime, who knows when.
Well, that's perhaps a place to end, because that's I think part of our future and our well-being is to pick these things up and to really be able to take an honest.
We have to incorporate shadow, including yours. Yes, we do indeed. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It was mooted many years ago by Warren Coleman, and I immediately said, I want Joe. And you agreed, and that was years back. And, both of us were always running around doing things, so we never got together. But Arthur was he asked me if I would do an interview for the journal, and I immediately said, if Joe will be the interviewer, and thank you very much for agreeing to be that.
Well, I'm just delighted that we had this chance, and it was such fun to look over, the breadth of your work and to think about all of your contributions. Some of the ones personally that I've benefited with you, like chairing the ethics committee when I was president, and other things with the journal that you helped me with on various occasions. But
Joe, you're always so generous. But thank you for all the contributions you've made. We're all aware of just how much you do and how much you contribute. Thank you for doing this.
Well, it's been a real pleasure and a joy. So thanks, Anne. I'm going to now stop the recording.
Bye-bye.